Well, thank you so much. And I want to just pause for a second to thank everybody who's been so kind and welcoming to me in the last, I guess it's 48 hours, isn't it? Since I want to thank the board very much. This is the second time the board of this church has invited me to be here in 25 years. I don't think it's the same board. I think I'm the same person, but I've undergone certain changes since then. I do want to thank the licensed teachers, especially those who form the ministerial team, the ministry team. They stepped forward at a very important point in this church's history at a time of really radical change, and they helped preserve that sense of positive direction, and I want us to thank those folks. Where's Gary? He's here someplace. There he is. Thank you. Thank you, Gary. And, of course, I want to thank the staff, whom I haven't worked with yet. Well, I'll tell you next week. No, I know they're lovely people. If they're Unity folk, they're wonderful. And everything is fine. Thank you so very much. And I'd like to just, for a few moments, pause to mention your former minister, Skye St. John. Last time my wife, Carol, and I were here, and she's still with me. It's our 50th anniversary this year. Would you believe it? She's with the grandkids in North Carolina, and I think she'll join me as soon as they let her go, but I'm not. Last time I was here, guess who was seated at that piano? Skye St. John, and his name was Patrick then. And he was a wonderfully versatile individual, fantastic guy, had a lot of fun together. He had a wonderful sense of humor. More importantly, he had a real grasp of Unity principles, which, of course, he later translated into a very personal ministry. And I feel the best way that we can honor his memory, frankly, is to continue to teach the principles that he espoused. Thank you. Sometimes we pay greater attention to the messenger than to the principles that he or she taught. But in this instance, I know Skye would want us, if his ministry meant anything here at all over 9 years, he would want us to continue in the traditions that he laid down and to follow the principles that he taught, and it is his utmost to express. So I'm pledged to do that. Everything I say to you during my stay here will be reflective of what I understand to be the truth that Skye understood, because we both understand or believe in the same things. Thank you very much for that appreciation.
We can change the world.
And we can change the world. Do you believe it? Thank you, thank you, thank you. I want to talk about change. I want to talk about change because change has meant a great deal in my life, and I suspect in yours too. Change has always been recognized by the great teachers, spiritual teachers, who've come to us in the world as avatars, perhaps as wonderful, wonderful, spiritually insightful people. They've said, in order to grow and to learn spiritually, in order to begin to experience the joy, the wonder of the eternal nature of our being, we need to transform ourselves. We are aware that we are not where we need to be, and we know that there are steps that have to be taken to get there. And change is how we reach that wonderful, that divine goal. Even the ancient Greeks, those old gentlemen with longer beards than mine who 2,000 years ago sat down and pondered the nature of the world. And they weren't just men, there were some women amongst them, not just the poet, whom we remember for her beautiful sapphic poems, but also, I'm sure, some women of great intellect and spiritual insight who said, yes, the world we live in is a changing world. Everywhere I look, there is change. Change. And we must understand and recognize that. Even a rock standing there. No, that rock won't change. That's going to be there forever. Of course it's not. The rock, in the end, dissolves just as surely as everything else and changes its form, assumes a new proportion. And they called it metamorphosis. And that word has passed, or two words as a matter of fact, in Greek, meta and morphe mean after change. Two words, metamorphe. That word metamorphosis has come into our language and is synonymous, of course, with change. But even in our own world, even in the world today, governed as it is predominantly by the scientific method, that same maxim applies. What is the aim and goal of science? I was told when I started college 1,000 years ago, possibly 1,500, that the aim of science was to predict and to control change so that we might master it for our own uses. Now, whether this has been good or bad, I leave to a jury quite different from one I might compose, but that's been at the heart of our scientific method for the last 300 or 400 years. But in our own personal lives, I think we've come to realize that it's how we respond, how sometimes we react to change that really matters, that can be the great predictor of whether we shall grow spiritually and help others to grow spiritually through our insights, or whether we shall, as it were, lie quiescent and do nothing. No, sometimes change obliges us to ourselves, change in our circumstances, change surrounding us, and we rise to the challenge beautifully. If we are aware of what it means in our spiritual lives, we rise even more effectively with joy in our hearts, because the challenge is a positive one, and we are ready for it, and it helps us to grow and to learn, to move forward, and to help others who are on the path. Now at Easter, we think of renewal. We think of change. We talk about it because of what the master teacher told us and what he taught us about how we might change our lives dramatically. What an extraordinary personality Jesus must have been to see as he did in such a universal sense, to peer into the human psychology in such an acute way. I was always fascinated, even as a child, with a passage which I thought, above all others, taught me what Jesus was about. It's not at the end of Scripture. It's not during the Easter period. It's at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. And I want to share that passage with you. It's very brief, very short passage. And I'm reading from the New English Bible, not my favorite translation, not the great resonant King James, with its thees and thous and so forth, which many of us are used to. But this is the down-to-earth English, New English version. Some have called it bureaucratic English. This doesn't translate too badly. Jesus, this is at the beginning of Mark's Gospel. Very beginning of Jesus' ministry, very beginning. Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee when he saw Simon and his brother Andrew on the lake at work with a casting net. They were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Come with me, and I will make you fishers of men." And here's the phrase. Here's the phrase that puts that simple story into the most vivid of all contexts. He said, "I will make you fishers of men." And at once, without hesitation, at once, they left their nets and they followed him. Can I imagine what that decision cost those men? And there were others who followed, as we know. This is how Jesus chose his disciples. Disciples while they follow Jesus, apostles later when they're on their own. But disciples under the discipline, the teaching of Jesus. Can you imagine what a hugely significant decision that was for these simple men? Later on, men and women followed Jesus, made the decision to follow him. What did they see in the master teacher's eyes? Not arrogance, surely, but a deep confidence, a deep, deep confidence, a knowledge that he had seen something that they longed to see, that would give them all the comfort and joy and hope that they needed in this life to move successively through every challenge and change that might confront them. And so they left their nets and they left their boats. Do you know what precious artifacts they were in that time? Archaeologists in modern times have uncovered some of those ancient boats. And they've seen that they've been patched and patched over successive years. Sometimes those boats must have lasted 100 years. They were a means of livelihood. You didn't just leave them behind. You might have thought about it. You might have said, Jeshua bar Joseph, which is Jesus' name, Jeshua, meaning that his name, and then Bar, the son of Joseph. Jeshua bar Joseph, thank you very much. But I would like to think about it. Just give me a week. And do you have a telephone number where I could reach you? And I'll let you know about my decision. No. At once, they followed. At once. Later on, a couple of them left their father, their aged father, with the boat. And they said, no, where are we going? People don't make their minds up that rapidly even today. Back then, certainly not. They didn't have cell phones where they could say, Mom, don't worry. I'll be back in a couple of weeks. I'll call you. Or, there's a McDonald's on every corner. I'm not going to starve. It doesn't matter. You did not leave your livelihood. You did not leave your home. You did not leave your native village in those days unless you were prepared for the utmost and the most extreme of consequences, possibly even death. The Roman authorities who occupied Palestine at that period actively discouraged any movement of that sort. They didn't want to see people moving in groups across the countryside. They were a threat to law and order, to authority. And right up until the 17th century in Europe even, people stayed in their villages. They couldn't just wander around as they pleased. And I've always been fascinated by that phrase, at once. At once they left all of this. How could they do that? Could there be a more radical change imagined in anybody's life? But they did it because they saw in that master teacher some kind of sublime truth that they yearned for, that we all yearn for, some certainty that said, don't be afraid, please, cope with this change, find some good in it, and everything will be to your advantage in the truly spiritual way. Well, we're familiar with the successive story, I think, but that to me is the great story, the birth of that ministry. And Jesus taught them how to cope with change because he showed them that there was a higher truth than mere security. Now, I'm not suggesting you all rush to your boss tomorrow and say, hey, boss, I'm giving up. I'm leaving. I'm going back to the mainland tomorrow. I'm going to China. I'm going to try my luck in New Zealand. But prudence and common sense still play a role. But it's a dramatic example, as many dramatic examples tend to encourage us in this way. It is a dramatic example that tells us how change may come into somebody's life and how they may cope with it effectively and successfully because they have belief, confidence in a higher power and a greater truth. I always remember that when I was young, and I was young once. I was. I think. I always remember when I was a little boy, I had a fairly stable upbringing. Change was not part of my life for many years. I would come home from school and there was food on the table and all my things were in my little room, and I had a very, very secure early upbringing. And I've always remembered the first time that I encountered genuine change in my life and what a huge impact it had on that life. In England, I went to a boys' school, just all boys. I'm a dual citizen. I was born of American parents in England, and I went to an English, they call them public schools. They're really private schools. Brutal, crude, abusive, but very character-building. I was told. Yes, well, quite, as they say in England. No, it was a school devoted, of course, to the study of humane letters, and Shakespeare figured very highly on whatever curriculum there was. And once a year, a Shakespeare play was staged, and I remember I was very proud one year to have been chosen to play a page. Not the page you turn, but a page of a trifle more significance, in a Shakespeare play. I don't remember what the play was. I've never been able to remember what the play was. Whether that's a deliberate psychological evasion, I don't know, but let me tell you the story. Anyway, I was to play the page. I got to wear this very snazzy little tabard. Do you know what a tabard is? It's a very cute little sort of thingy that you sort of put over. It's like a little apron. Very nice. I don't know about the accoutrements that go with it, but anyway, the tabards are nice. But I rather was taken with that. But anyway, I got to wear a tabard with a sort of coat of arms on the front, and I was to come through a door in the scenery, a door, and walk up to the king. I've forgotten what king it was, King Lear, I don't remember. And I was supposed to say, my liege, I think I said, my liege, the lords of France and Burgundy await without. I didn't have quite such a resonant voice at the age of 8, but I squeaked up and did my best. I piped up. And we rehearsed this scene over and over again, of course, like all the others, because we had to do it right. Otherwise, the grim consequences would ensue. The most horrible... we won't get there. Anyway, I did my bit. On the great night, I did my bit with my little tabard. I came in. I went up to the kid who was playing the king, and I said, my liege, the lords of Burgundy await thee without. And I was to turn round and exit by another door after having said these words. Well, we'd rehearsed this many times, and I was entirely confident. And I walked away from the king, played by one of never mind, I won't go into that either. But I walked round, and the door wasn't there. Now, I've never been able to discover whether it was some malignant intent that caused one of my childish rivals to in some way remove that door, but it wasn't there anymore. And of course my embarrassment was complete. I was left there nonplussed, and of course the audience of critical parents, bless their hearts, always tend to be critical at moments like this, began to giggle, and my peers began to giggle, and finally somebody hissed from the wings, "This way, you fool." And never was fool more grateful for an exit than I at that point. I fled. But being a reasonably bright child for my years, a lesson began to materialize in my mind, and I thought, things aren't always the same. We have to learn to live with change, and we have to learn how to adapt to change. And so maybe this is an important function that I have to discern and to discover and to work with. Well, it was a good job I did learn that lesson at that early age, because just after then, a good deal of change ensued in my life. As a matter of fact, there was a lot of movement, a lot of change, some of it apparently good and some of it not so good. But I have come to the recognition, as I said before, that if we wish to grow, I suppose one might say intellectually and emotionally as well as spiritually, one has to find a way of coping effectively with change. Now, what I discovered when I came into Unity, and that wasn't too long after that, it was about 10 years after that experience, I found that Unity taught that good might come out of change. That sometimes change, however radical, however traumatic it might be, and sometimes it is, that good might come out of that change depending on our attitude, depending on whether we were willing to see good in the possibility of change or whether we were going to just reject it, be crushed, and suffer under it. And that had a tremendous impact on my life and on the lives of those I think that I've been around, because I said always, how do we cope with change? How do we work with change? And the truth of this assertion, how we work with change, was brought home to me just a matter of a couple of years ago, really, when a friend of mine had a business that went under. It collapsed altogether. Not surprising given the economic challenges that were present just a few years ago, and indeed still are present. He lost his business. Now, he'd worked up over the years quite an important business. He was quite well-to-do. He had made quite a good deal of money. He was physically quite comfortable and materially very successful, but he was finding that he couldn't function, he couldn't continue. And he, to cut the story short, lost his job, lost his position, lost his own company, as a matter of fact. And this change had such a decisive impact upon him. It really seemed to have broken him. But then he encountered spiritual teachings, and he said to himself, these changes don't affect the nature of my being, who I really am. These are externals, brutal externals, painful, hurtful. But somehow, if I can turn them to my benefit, if I can turn them to my, I was about to say profit almost, which is perhaps not a bad word, then I can reap something very important from this change that has come into my life, quite unbeknownst, quite unwillingly. And he did. He decided that he would use the knowledge that he had acquired during this painful experience to help others who were going through a similar trauma at the time. And indeed, he's quite successful today as a counselor who works with people who have lost their businesses as a result of the circumstances through which we've been moving lately in this and in other countries. But he refused to be broken by that change. He's brought from it, he's wrested from it, one might virtually say, a positive lesson and learned a huge amount as a result. He's become a very different person. In fact, when I met him some months ago, quite a while after this change ensued, I think it was back in 2009, I really didn't recognize him as a totally different person. Much less aggressive, certainly not confrontational, very loving, very cooperative, very compassionate. He had learned the great lesson of compassion. And he had become quite a different person. And he said to me, you know, there can be no growth without change. And if one embraces change, if one sees in it the possibility of a positive lesson, then of course the results can be absolutely startling and sometimes even profound. And I think I've learned something from what he said, but certainly I've learned through my own experience in life that change, some of it alarming, concerning, that change may, if we look for the good in it, utterly bring about not only transformation, but a progressive understanding in our lives, a transformation, so that we are changed people. Sometimes we move from indifference to compassion, which is in itself a huge leap. Sometimes we move from condemnation to acceptance, another huge leap, all brought about by change. If we are static, if we never move, if we are never challenged, then in effect nothing happens. Now, sometimes we find that a disagreeable lesson. But I think if we look at these changes, many of them frightening, even alarming, positively, and we expect to find positive change in them, then such will be the case. There has been great change in this church, certainly since I was here last, but I regard this as entirely positive, because fresh opportunities for growth have been presented all of you. And I hope when I'm here, presented me as well. Opportunities to grow, to learn, to transform, to find in ourselves fresh dimensions of compassion and love for one another. But you see, the wonderful thing is, when you consider change, and this is the great truth, folks, now is the moment of supreme revelation that you have been waiting for. Now, I approach my peroration. I have a friend at a famous university who's a leading physicist, and he doesn't believe in God, but he said if there were a God, that God would be a constant. And that, I think, is the truth, because for me, what we call God is the love, the acceptance, the joy, the recognition that eternal life itself awaits us no matter what. It is not contingent. It is there. But this is not limited and confined in any sense to time. Time moves from A to Z. Time is linear. We live in time, which is where we encounter change. But as a wise old 18th century divine used to say, time, and I've forgotten his name, time and eternity are clean, different things. When we step over the threshold from time to eternity, which certainly we all shall, it is the final transformation that we shall all undergo, just as our beloved friend and Minister Sky underwent it. When we step over that threshold, and I've been there, I have been there in a near-death experience, an experience which I can't describe to you because words don't describe it and cannot describe it. There's a sudden realization that time does not exist, that there is a universal oneness so beautiful, so amazing, so extraordinary, so vivid, so loving, so accepting, light itself, that never changes. It never has, it never shall, it cannot. It is the one and the same. Every great mystic and spiritual adept has tried to explain it. None has succeeded because no words that come out of the mouth of a human being can do it. But this is what awaits us. And the more we learn to cope with change in time in positive ways, the more we look for the good in change, the more we fit ourselves for that ultimate translation. The more we fit ourselves for that movement from this world of change and uncertainty into that world of joy, certainty, and abundant good, the very life eternal that awaits us. So let's not fear change. Let's look at change and say, oh, okay, bring on change. Where's the good in it? Where's the lesson? What can I learn? How can I take from it what I need? How can I help others as a result of my experience, sometimes even my confrontation with change? Because that's what life's about. Helping others, helping ourselves, moving forward so that we can prepare ourselves more effectively for the ultimate encounter that we shall have with the eternal life and love that produced us, that sustain us always still, if we allow it. Thank you, I'm finished, I'm done.